Imagine a time of disorder when fear ruled and courage was scarce. In a society dominated by men, a woman rose up as a leader, defying all expectations and leading her people to victory. Her name was Deborah, prophetess, judge, and warrior. This is not just the story of a fearless leader, but a testimony to the power of faith, wisdom, and obedience to God, capable of turning the impossible into reality. What you may not know is that her journey reveals surprising truths about what it means to trust God in times of crisis. Israel was going through a dark period. For 20 years, the Hebrew people suffered under the brutal oppression of Jabin, king of Canaan. His general Sisera was a feared commander, known for his cruelty and ruthless military strategies. His army boasted 900 iron chariots, unprecedented war power at the time. For the Israelites, these chariots were not just weapons, they were symbols of terror. Jabin's soldiers dominated the land, and any attempt at resistance seemed futile. But this oppression was not the result of chance. It was the consequence of the unfaithfulness of the people of Israel. They had broken their covenant with God, worshipping false gods and ignoring the commandments that set them apart from the other nations. The result was a painful cycle of sin and suffering. Every time Israel turned away from God, oppression set in. But in their anguish, the people cried out for help. Their prayers, full of despair, went up to heaven. It was then that God raised up an unlikely deliverer, Deborah. Unlike previous leaders, Deborah was not a warrior or a king. She was a prophetess, the only woman among Israel's judges. Her role was unique and unexpected, especially in a society where leadership was almost exclusively male. Sitting under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, high in the mountains of Ephraim, Deborah became the center of justice in Israel. From all over, people came to her for guidance and discernment, trusting in her wisdom to settle disputes and reveal God's will. But Deborah was more than a judge. She was a beacon of hope in the midst of Israel's spiritual decline. While the men hesitated, overwhelmed by fear, she remained firm in her faith. Her courage contrasted with the apathy of a people who seemed to have lost the will to fight. Faced with the oppression of Jabin and Sisera, no one dared to stand up. Israel's leaders were paralyzed, unable to act. It was Deborah who broke this cycle, responding to the divine call to free her nation. One day, the word of the Lord came to her with a clear command: "Summon Barak, son of Abinoam, to lead an army against Sisera's forces." Deborah sent a messenger to Barak, who lived in Kadesh, in the tribe of Naphtali. When he came before the judge, she gave him the divine order. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and take them to Mount Tabor. There I will lure Sisera and his army to the river Kishon, where I will deliver his troops into your hands." It was a bold plan. Attacking a powerful army equipped with iron chariots seemed like suicide. The Israelites had no advanced weaponry or sophisticated military training. Even so, the promise of victory came directly from God. But Barak's response revealed his uncertainties. He said to Deborah, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't, I won't." Barak wanted Deborah's presence as a guarantee that God was really with them. His hesitation showed his total lack of trust in God's promise. Deborah answered firmly, "I will certainly go with you. But know that because of your attitude, the honor of victory will not be yours. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." With this prophetic declaration, Deborah anticipated an unexpected outcome to the battle that was about to take place. Barak and Deborah summoned the men of Naphtali and Zebulun, gathering an army of 10,000 warriors. News of their mobilization spread, awakening a new spirit among the Israelites. Inspired by Deborah's faith, they prepared to face the enemy. The stage was set. The moment of battle was approaching. But no one could have predicted how God would intervene in an extraordinary way to turn this war into an unforgettable triumph. With the 10,000 men ready for battle, Deborah and Barak set off for Mount Tabor. Meanwhile, Sisera received news of the Israelite army's movements. Confident in the superiority of his iron chariots and the strength of his soldiers, he immediately gathered his troops and marched towards the river Kishon. The Israelites were outnumbered and had fewer resources, but they possessed something the Canaanites didn't: the promise of God himself. Even so, fear hung in the air. The warriors knew they were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives. As the enemy armies positioned themselves in the valley below, Deborah turned to Barak and with a firm voice full of divine authority proclaimed, "Go! This is the day the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hands. The Lord has already gone before you." With that declaration, hesitation dissipated. Barak led his men in a blitz attack down the mountain towards the mighty Canaanite army. Sisera, accustomed to dominating the battlefield, had not expected such boldness from the Israelites. But at that moment, something extraordinary happened. Out of nowhere, a violent storm formed. Gusts of wind swept through the valley, followed by a torrential downpour that turned the dry ground into a treacherous mire. What seemed like an overwhelming advantage for Sisera became his undoing. His dreaded iron chariots, which normally cut through the fields like blades, got stuck in the mud. The horses, terrified by the thunder and the slippery ground, panicked. The Canaanite army, disorganized and vulnerable, was overwhelmed by confusion. Barak's warriors advanced with ferocity, attacking their enemies without mercy. What had once seemed like a lost battle for the Israelites now became an improbable victory, forged by the hand of God himself. Sisera, seeing his army slaughtered, abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. His confidence and arrogance were gone. The great commander of the Canaanites was now just a desperate man running for his life. Meanwhile, the Israelites continued their attack. One by one, Sisera's soldiers fell, until none were left standing. Jabin's army was completely destroyed. Canaanite rule, which had oppressed Israel for 20 years, was coming to an end. But the story wasn't over yet. Sisera's fate would take an unexpected and surprising turn. Exhausted and out of options, the fugitive general spotted an isolated tent and ran towards it. It was the camp of Heber the Kenite, a man who maintained a neutral alliance with King Jabin. As he approached, he was greeted by Jael, Heber's wife. With a calm and welcoming look, she invited him in, offering him a safe haven. "Come in, my lord. Don't be afraid," she said, covering him with a blanket to reassure him. Sisera, exhausted, asked for water, but Jael went further and offered him warm milk, helping him to relax. He could barely keep his eyes open. Before he fell into a deep sleep, he ordered, "Keep watch at the tent door. If anyone asks if there's anyone here, say no." But Jael had other plans. While Sisera slept soundly, she took a hammer and a tent peg. With precision and determination, she placed the stake over the general's temple and with a firm blow, drove it through his head, pinning him to the ground. The feared commander of the Canaanites, responsible for decades of oppression, met his end not in battle, but at the hands of a woman. Shortly afterwards, Barak arrived in pursuit of Sisera. Jael came out of the tent and calmly said, "Come, I'll show you the man you're looking for." When Barak entered, he saw Sisera's body lying with a stake through his head. Deborah's prophecy had been fulfilled in an unexpected way. The glory of victory did not go to Barak, but to a woman, as God had announced. With the death of Sisera, Israel gained the momentum it needed to end Jabin's domination once and for all. The Canaanite king lost his main general, and, over time, his strength dissipated. The Israelites, now strengthened, marched against his city and destroyed his oppressive government. Victory was not won by swords and strategy alone, but by God's direct intervention. He used unlikely instruments, a prophetess, a hesitant leader, and a foreign woman, to change the fate of a nation. With the death of Sisera and the destruction of the Canaanite army, King Jabin's rule began to crumble. Without his most powerful commander and without the military force that sustained his tyranny, Jabin was weakened little by little until the Israelites finally defeated him. The oppression that had lasted 2 decades came to an end. The people of Israel, once terrified and subjugated, now celebrated the freedom they had won not by their own strength, but by God's direct intervention. Deborah, the prophetess and judge, who had unwaveringly trusted in the Lord's promises, witnessed the fulfillment of what he had promised. Her leadership not only led Israel to victory, but also rekindled the faith of a people who had forgotten their God. But the story doesn't end with military victory alone. The memory of this great deed needed to be preserved for future generations, so that Israel would never again turn away from its Creator. And so Deborah did something that would echo for centuries. She composed a song of praise and celebration, a song that would eternalize this moment in the history of her people. Standing before Israel, Deborah raised her voice and intoned, "Praise the Lord, for the leaders of Israel have come forward willingly, and the people have offered themselves readily for battle. Listen, kings, listen, rulers. I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will play songs to the Lord, the God of Israel." Her song told the story of Israel's oppression, the cowardice of the men who didn't stand up to fight, and the courage of those who trusted in the Lord. She exalted the tribes who answered the call to battle and rebuked those who hesitated. Deborah described in detail the power of God in the battle, recalling how the Lord made the earth tremble and the heavens pour down torrential rain to defeat the enemies. From the heavens the stars fought. From their orbits they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon carried them away. The ancient river Kishon swept away the mighty. But she didn't stop there. In her song, Deborah exalted the woman who fulfilled the prophecy and brought the final blow to the great enemy commander. May Jael be the most blessed among women. Her hand reached for the stake. Her right hand grasped the worker's hammer. She struck Sisera, crushed his head, pierced his temple. With poetic verses, Deborah even portrayed Sisera's mother waiting in vain for her son to return, unaware that he had already been defeated at the hands of a simple woman. Deborah's song was not just a praise of victory, but a solemn reminder that God fights for those who trust in him. Her song was an eternal testimony to the Lord's faithfulness and the importance of obedience. And so Israel had peace for 40 years. The generation that experienced this great deliverance experienced a time of prosperity and security. As long as Deborah lived, her leadership was a mark of justice and wisdom. But Israel's history shows that whenever the people turned away from God, oppression returned. The question remained, how long would Israel remember this lesson? The story of Deborah is not just a narrative about war and deliverance. It is a powerful testimony about faith, courage, and the way God uses unlikely people to fulfill his purposes. Deborah was not a warrior in the traditional sense. She didn't wield a sword or lead soldiers on the battlefield in the way you would expect from a military commander. However, her influence, her unwavering trust in the Lord and her leadership were the driving force behind Israel's victory. She showed that true strength does not lie in weapons or the number of soldiers, but in obedience to God. While the men of Israel hesitated, while Barak doubted, it was Deborah who stood firm, believing in God's promise. And her story holds lessons that live on to this day. Firstly, we learn that God does not choose leaders based on human standards. In a patriarchal society, he chose a woman to rule and liberate Israel. Deborah didn't have to conform to the expectations of her time. She was used by God exactly as she was, and that was enough. Secondly, we see that obedience to God is more important than human strength. Barak had the call to lead the army, but he hesitated. His reluctance meant that the final victory went to someone else, the simple Jael, who would never have been seen as a war hero. This reminds us that God honors those who respond to his call promptly, not those who hesitate out of fear. And finally, Deborah's story teaches us that true leadership does not seek power or glory, but rather to serve and lead with wisdom. Deborah did not seek status or recognition. Her role was inspired by her faith and her dedication to the people of Israel. Her leadership brought justice, peace, and hope to a lost nation. Even after her victory, Deborah did not claim the credit for herself. Instead, she sang a song of praise, exalting God's name. Because after all, it wasn't about her. It was about the Lord's faithfulness and his power to deliver his people. Deborah's legacy echoes down the centuries. Her story challenges us to trust God, to respond to his call, and to remember that he often works through those the world least expects. If this story has inspired you, imagine how many others there are in the Bible waiting to be rediscovered. Join us as we continue to explore incredible stories full of faith, courage, and transformation. Subscribe to the channel and share this journey with others. Together, let's bring to light the stories that have shaped the world and continue to teach us today. Because when we trust in God, the impossible becomes reality.